Welcome to the Awaken podcast. My name is Natasja Pelgrom, and we are live here with Breaking Convention 2025 in Exeter University. And we've had the privilege to already have a few interviews here. And today I want to introduce Dr. Bruce. Welcome.
Thank you.
And I'm going to read a little bit your bio, because from so many people, I have not mesmerized you as your bio. I've made a shorter one, right? So in 2022, astrobiologist, Dr. Bruce Damer, right? Yeah. Disclosed how ayahuasca catalyzed a profound insight into the question of how life began. Published and tested, this visionary experience generated a leading hypothesis in science. And in 2023, he co-founded the Center of Minds to support research into psychedelics can be more widely employed for breakthrough insights in science, tech, design, and leadership, asking the question, can the medicines of healing also serve as an elixir for discovery? I am so excited because this is my jam.
Right.
So maybe we can start off with the question around the origins of life research that you've stepped into, and navigating also the responses from the scientific community of being so outspoken with mind-altering and expanding substances. So maybe you would like to explore that with us first.
Yeah, I think that our field of biochemistry and chemistry has a long history of visionary practice, all the way back to the discovery of the benzene ring. You remember the famous Ouroboros story, the man had in a hypnagogic dream state, to Francis Crick's purported visionary experiences with LSD in the 50s, and then Kary Mullis, who used LSD as a tool to help him come up with gene sequencing, basically PCR. So it's kind of baked in. It seems to be baked into people with chemical minds, you know. And so one of the hardest problems in science, one of the core problems in biology, is the origin of life. How life can start from a jumble of inanimate molecules to become animated into living cells. And it's a question I took up when I was 14. And I started having visionary downloads, which I now call endotrips, because they come from within without any exogenous or exo introduction, any stimulant. And I sort of lived in the world of endotrips for much of my young life and into my young adulthood before I encountered psychedelics in my 30s, which then created the exo-endo merger. And then 10 years of sort of that dance of which psychedelic, which setting, and which setup that I could bring the complexity of this problem. I could front load or prime the problem. Meeting my colleague, Dave Deemer, who became my mentor. You always need mentors in science to put it all in the right context of the hot spring and little protocells, and then getting up to that point where we couldn't get beyond it. So I was literally, it was like a 35-year priming, all the way to the point where I decided to use the tools of both endogenous visioning and sort of exo stimulation and sort of the magisterium, if you will, to ask that question, how did we all begin?
Wow, and from that young age, did you have a framework or a curiosity to explore this further?
You mean in terms of psychedelics or?
Yeah, I mean, to find meaning in what you were experiencing, or did you have an environment that was open to it that you would share what you were experiencing?
Entirely crypto for me. It was entirely an internal state. I was adopted, and when my parents brought me home, my mother's first sort of flash blink intuition was, this one is in its own world. So whatever happens when you're given up for adoption in the adoption world, maybe you can go internal and become your own spacecraft or something. Who knows what happens?
Yeah.
But so I kind of at age 9 or 10 realized, when you close your eyes after a stimulating day, you see all these flashes and color patterns, and most people will say yes, that this has happened to them. I saw this as a sort of a TV channel, and could I tune it? Could I get it to become more vibrant or resolve into form. So I developed a practice of tuning myself down while these color patterns became resolved into multicolor, and then objects would just come out of nowhere. And so I said, this is it. I'm going to make sure that this is a technology I can use. And so by practicing over and over and drawing those scenes, thousands of drawings, then I turned that into my profession.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's really interesting because it reminds me of an example. I'm going a little bit off topic, but that's just because of what you said about a TV. And there are children that have the capability of remote viewing and remote listening. And one of the patterns that they started recognizing was that that children could see different TVs and then like a TV screen, and then tune into it and go into that almost narrative and story. And I've had personally a similar kind of experience on an expanded state, but actually through darkness, not through taking any substance, to have the same kind of attunement into the frequency. And it almost looks like a TV. You're looking at a TV and then you have a choice to go inside. Have you ever heard of this phenomenon?
I've sort of been reading more about it recently.
Yeah.
And I think that we're connected in ways we haven't plumbed yet.
Yeah.
So there's some kind of conductive medium. I think it's the great project of the 21st century is to identify that conductive medium that links living forms and it links minds. And I think we're sort of on the tail of it, but just the beginning.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was yesterday at the press gathering, and once everybody left, there was someone that shared a story that I didn't know, a story about you, so I just want to verify if it's true, that you had received an insight from an entity and brought that information to NASA. And maybe you can elaborate a little bit, because I heard it through a third party, and I would love to hear it through the first party.
The first party.
Yeah.
So as with anything in science, there's a sort of fermentation baking period. Yeah. So these things don't sort of appear out of nowhere. So you're asking a question and you're putting an attention maybe out into some kind of a field through this conductive medium, a wish or desire, but it's super informed. It's like when you make a server call or you ask an AI, give them a prompt. It sort of prompts the field. Yeah. And then you have to be patient. So if you give an AI, the AI is busy, getting all these, if an AI is a metaphor for God, you say your prayers and then the answers don't come, or the wish for the prayer doesn't come immediately, and then not in a form you can predict when and where. So patience happens, and then there's a sort of digestion, I think, and then a download can come one day. Yeah. So in terms of visual insight, not necessarily somatic insight or those other things, I learned that there's the incubation period, and then when it comes, you're just ready for it. And there's a whole technology that I developed to navigate it. It's like the download starts to come, and you just put everything on pause. Put your phone away for sure. Put your phone on mute. Everything stops, and then you just accept. So you don't try to. You just open your system as clearly, gently, and completely as possible, so that this thing can come in, because it's a subtle game. It's not so the download game isn't like, a major psychedelic experience where it just comes on no matter what. You almost have to coax it in a little bit and try to keep your distractions at a minimum, and then accept what comes. So whatever comes, and it could run for an hour. In some cases for me, 45 minutes or an hour has been the extent of the downloads. And then there's a practice of awareness, and maybe it's sort of like the Zen Buddhist practice of just being an observer. And then there's a camera function that I've sort of perfected over the years, where I'll swing the view around and just neutrally observe and start recording. So if something's happening that clearly is a big informational detail, I'll really focus everything on capturing that and recording the tape as much as possible, and carefully sort of stowing it somehow. Like, this is important, flag that as important, then let it go, and then track the next one. And it doesn't really matter what's coming. You don't question it. You don't take it up in your imagination and try to analyze it. Just let it come. And then there's a feeling, it's like a tractor beam when it's now time to go. It's time to leave it. And you don't stay in it. You just, like a surfer, if you are surfing a wave, you surf a huge set of waves, and then on that last wave, you've got to get off. Because otherwise you're going to, end up on the rocks, basically. So you pull out gently and let it go and just be quiet. And don't let the monkey mind or the questioning analytic brain go in and try to work it. What you then need to do is sit with it and then re-trip it effectively. Go in again, gently coax it back into existence. And you could even take some notes, or I would speak into a voice recorder so I can get the full emotional, and then sketch it, draw it, and keep it precious. Like it's in a file store that is like behind a firewall, because you don't want the imagination to come in and reinterpret and tell a story about it. And what I found over the years is that I now have a big media library of those things that I can re-trip and bring back into a future download, whether it's an endo trip or an exo trip or both. I can then stack them together. I can rerun them to prime the whole system. And then it allows the tripping state or the magisterium or whatnot some place to start and to go to the next one and the next one. And then you can solve multivariate hard problems that way. So we visioned this, and then we verified this, and retrip that, and then we don't know where to go. And that's how the Origin of Life vision came with ayahuasca. I wouldn't say really it was an entity. It was sort of a relationship, because many people sort of feel that there's a relationship, with sometimes called Mother Ayahuasca or some kind of an entity. And that's how it was done. We literally in one 10-minute session, after taking ayahuasca about 20 times, this is in the Peruvian Amazon, I had gone through, with the guidance of the medicine, my own conception and birth, that explained how I had love of my parents that I hadn't met until adulthood, actually. And it relaxed my system. So I had a healing, and then suddenly I was clear, ready for a revealing. And I invited the entity to join me on a journey back through time, through the sperm of my father, which became into the body of my grandfather and kept going, through endo trips that would take us back 4 billion years to the volcanic island, which had the hot spring pools that are bubbling and cycling there, to then ask the question, how were we all born? What was our common birth? And it was all that priming and all that setup and the re-tripping of previous visionary states that had been verified by science and by practice, getting to that point of the unknown, jumping off, and then becoming the first protocell. As David Luke talks about, psychedelic perspectivism, dying and being reborn as the protocell, screaming and trying to divide and create its other. And that was a key moment in the Origin of Life that we'd never looked at before. We'd always sort of said, well, we'll start from building blocks and build up the proto-cell that might eventually have the functions of biology. Instead, the vision gave me an entirely new experience, which was look at the moment when these protocells have some biological function, but they're trying to divide and create the daughter cells through selection, through the machinery is starting to work. Because that's the transition to the microbial world from the pre-microbial, pre-life world, just sort of semi-alive. And it was that vision, literally me screaming as the stillbirth happened, created a dead offspring, and watching the polymers rippling and being read and written. So my camera went over and did a high-speed recording of that. And then the next few days and few months of interpreting that, because that didn't give me an answer. It primed me for an endo trip 2.5 months later, where it all downloaded in this 45-minute visionary, like, oh my God, it's the entire cycle. I now see the whole cycling system. So that was sort of the architecture of that particular one, which is perhaps, as Einstein talked about the happiest moment of his life being realizing that the man falling in the falling elevator was the same as, and then the elevator's no longer falling and he could feel the gravity on his feet, that would be the same thing as if the elevator was in space and he's floating in it, and then suddenly there's a rocket pushing the elevator and he feels the pressure on his feet, that the gravity and acceleration were the same thing. And that was through a visionary download. That was through an endo trip, and it led to general relativity.
Yeah.
And he described it as the happiest moment of his life, realizing the equivalence of those two things. So similar architecture, really.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing this pattern, because it's a recognizing of patterns and almost an anatomy of the internal visual experience that I've experienced since childhood. So I'm hearing a lot of recognition, first of all, so I'm just being selfish right now to say thank you for myself, because there is a recognition in terms of how you map out each construct and how you safeguard it and not make meaning when you know that this is not meaning-making egoic structure yet. And it needs to come in at the right time to make meaning, but not yet.
Yeah, very well put.
Yeah. So that's a shift. Now I'm very curious, because I want to bridge this to the regions of life and what you've seen and discovered and been able to translate also in artificial intelligence. Now I'm questioning even the word artificial intelligence. So I'm wondering, let's start off. What do you think it should be titled, and is it artificial intelligence from your perspective?
I think it's augmented intelligence.
Yeah.
That would have been terms used in the 1960s at SRI by I'm spacing on his name, but he talked about augmentation.
Yeah.
I think that's where we are. We're not in an authentic autonomous intelligence as yet. Yeah.
Yeah. And how do you feel that this quality that is rising and expanding so swiftly right now can help support the questions around regions of life?
Yeah. So here's a perfect example. The problem or the challenge of the origin of life, it wasn't necessarily all solved in that those two visionary states. There's much more complexity involved. It's much deeper. It keeps going deeper and deeper and deeper. And one of the challenges in the origin of life is the arising of super unlikely combinations of little chains of molecules. Leslie Orgel, who's a very great thinker in our field, talked about the arising of a enzyme, which might be 50 or 60 base lengths in length, exact precise enzyme, that does a certain catalytic job, is very unlikely, not being guided by genes, like it's spontaneous arising. It's actually less likely than like the history of the universe and the remaining history of the universe. But he said the arising of cycles of them, which a lot of our colleagues have proposed, is to appeal to magic. So it's the central problem in how life began, getting that first little widget that can make a copy of itself and make another widget which makes a copy of the original widget. And you get an autocatalytic cycle. You get a thing that now can sustain itself and make more of itself, but it's just one molecule. And that's hard. That's the hard problem of the origin of life. And we think we found the answer. And it involved actually three things. One was a visionary download, an endo trip, which happened in a sandwich shop in Reno, Nevada.
Okay. I love that it's so mundane.
So mundane. Looking at the sandwich with my colleague Dave Beamer, we were going out to a geyser near the Burning Man site to do some science for the BBC. And I just realized it's the sandwich is the thing. We are looking at the compartments, but when the compartments dry down in the pool, they squeeze together and form these layers. And most of our colleagues would form these proto cells with the compartments and study those, but they're liquidy. And in liquid solution, things don't get together very easily. But when they form the sandwich, everything's squeezed together. And it turns out that the the molecules attach themselves to the bits of the sandwich and they start moving around, and it becomes a combinatorial machine.
Mhm.
Like A meets B, which meets Z, which meets C, which meets. And I thought, this has got to be the medium that overcomes this probabilistic mountain of getting to a rare combination. It has to be.
Yeah.
So then a year later, I took another psychedelic and I asked the question. I posed the question for, what is this sandwich? And the power of tryptamines allow you to get into a visual state where you see the entire engine working in high detail. Like you're literally almost at the molecular level inside it and watching the flows. And it was vivid, absolutely vivid and convincing. And I missed some things in what were going on. Then I took the psychedelically upgraded endotrip vision and threw it at AI. So we threw it at Catherine, and I were both using AI at the same time. She was using,
Just for the viewers, Catherine is your partner,
is
right?
my partner.
Okay, just so they know who Catherine is.
Yeah, and she was hauling me kicking and screaming into the world of AI.
Yeah.
It's a little bit of out of date usually by a few years. And we were using all the AIs for different purposes, all in parallel, and watching how they had different capacities for different things. And I threw it at DeepSeek the first time, and I've been throwing it at ChatGPT because they're getting better than each other. And I didn't think that it was going to be able to handle this very technical, very mechanical chemical problem, but it did just fine. So I said, okay, and this is a 3-hour session.
Yeah.
Incubate the following problem, giving it a setup to then have its own endotrip,
Yeah.
going and searching the literature and putting in a construct, and it spat out all this math and computations and said, yes, this lipid sandwich is far more likely to allow that rare thing to emerge. This is extremely suggestive, and here are 16 references. And then I kept probing and pushing and asking it to compute on just a square centimeter how many molecules can attach. It said 10 to the power of 13, which is trillions. And I said, okay, well, given that they're mobile, go and find the science around mobility, how they're moving around on this like pegboard, and how many encounters will happen per second. Twice that many per second, 2 times 10 to the power 13. And I said, hey man, you're hallucinating. That can't be.
Yeah.
That can't be. No, here's the literature, which I never would have found some of this literature.
Yeah.
Some of it's from cancer research, some of it's from thermodynamics over here. It's like, oh my goodness, it's just done, it's helped us create a new discovery, an elixir of discovery. And then I asked it, the key question was this rare thing that we think could be one of the first replicators, which is a piece of RNA and a piece of peptide getting together, stabilizing each other, and then doing this job that is virtually impossible to arise in the history of the universe. It's floating around in bulk water. When will it, how will it happen in the system that's open and it's making all these random things? It's virtually instantaneous. The chat wrote back. I again said, you're hallucinating, buddy. Virtually instantaneous. Let's go through this. So we deeper and deeper and deeper dive, and basically doing 4 years of really hard combinatorial work in an hour. And so then taking that now psychedelically AI upgraded, and I realized that by working with AI, AI is like the amanuensis that composers talk about. The classical composers talk about their amanuensis, which is their note taker, which takes all the drafts and does all the scoring. And it can be an intelligent amanuensis. It can be their music partner and suggest certain things, but it's their pegboard again for how they're composing. Symphonic composition is really complex. And I thought, this is my amanuensis for science. And it's just phenomenal. And so, ship it off to Dave Deemer for his review. And David never even thought of this. And he's one of the great membrane biophysicists alive today. He's the inventor of the nanopore sequencing technology. And so he's like stunned. So he and I now are putting it into an article, it's due in a couple of months, that will be a complete flip for the entire field of astrobiology.
Wow. That's amazing, because if I understood correctly, from 4 years into an hour?
Into probably a few days, but with 20 years of preparation.
Yes,
Yeah.
of course, because this is the thing, it's a literal reflection of what you know and the ability of ask questions.
And our field, like colleagues we've never met and never will met, being the pillars of some of this.
Yes.
And it's a great composition. It's a great and beautiful composition. And we now have to craft it down into a visual figures in the paper, and then convince our colleagues to actually switch to experiments in the sandwich, in the dried state.
Yeah.
And convince them that this is where we need to look now for the next 25 years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if we bridge this, because you already said the elixir, and going, okay, how can we now move this into, for me, it's human flourishing. So that's my personal passion and mission, is can we go beyond the state of the wounding, and what can we now expand? What are untapped resources in our bodies and our minds too, but also in our bodies. So with the Center of Minds, this is also creativity, leadership. Maybe you can speak, because you're the president of that, and with your partner, and maybe you could speak into the Center of Minds and what you create with this elixir.
Yeah, what we think is possible. So the history of this is fascinating, because when psychedelics hit the West, psychedelics have been with us for thousands of years, but when they hit the West, it came first through this great book called The Doors of Perception, written by Aldous Huxley, one of the great minds of the 20th century, great intellects. And it was the morning after Humphrey Osmond had driven from Saskatchewan with a bottle of mescaline pills. They're using LSD for alcohol addiction treatment in Saskatchewan. So they're already using psychedelics in a healing modality, even in 1951, 2, 3. And he gave Huxley his first mescaline experience. And the next morning, and this is recorded in a volume of letters called Psychedelic Prophets, they talk about the #1 project we talked about after, the next morning was that clearly these substances, and there was no name psychedelics, because Osmond himself coined the term psychedelics 2 years later in 1956. And they said, they clearly give insight into the self, into the psyche, the healing in our terms. But perhaps they can give us the capacity for outsight into the world, insight to outsight. And they set up a project called Outsight. And they tried to get funding, and they had a short list of 50 to 100 really smart people, including Albert Einstein and Carl Jung, of all people, to take LSD, or take mescaline or LSD in a beautiful setting with people recording it, them getting prompted to work on problems. And this would have been happening in 1955, which didn't happen because they couldn't get funding from Ford Foundation or other things, other philanthropy, and they gave up. And this concept then came through again in the early 1960s. And if you read the 1964 publication of Psychedelic Reader, Gerald Hurd's the first article by Gerald Hurd talks about this, talks about the intellect, talks about, basically outsight, that prompted studies in California with Willis Harman. And Jim Fadiman was involved in those studies. And they took 25, I think, professionals into a lab sort of setting, gave them mescaline, and then they worked on professional problems. And the results are breathtaking. Michael Pollan chronicles this in his book and in the Netflix series. And then they got the letter from the governor of California saying, all this is illegal.
Yeah.
They chose not to open the letter for a few days, and they got their results off for publication.
Yeah.
And it was a pilot study on psychedelics as creative catalysts for problem solving. And that was the end. And there were some follow-up papers, but that was the end of it. And as we know, psychedelics for therapeutics came back, and we're in that world now. But I felt this very deeply, that this abandoned thread, this cut thread needed to be taken up again.
Yeah.
And there's some early compelling studies at Maastricht, Natasja Mason and Manesh Gurn, his amazing paper, that was a fantastic review of this. Yeah. And I decided in 2022 to come out of the psychedelic closet, because our science, our hot spring hypothesis, was in publication. It had been tested in the field in hot springs by ourselves and colleagues. It was working, and the field was undergoing the paradigm shift away from the ocean origins to land again, where Darwin thought life began in a warm little pond. And so we had done that, and so that the risk to the science, or us being accepted, or us, for instance, me being able to serve on NASA review panels or get grants, was lower, because it was kind of accepted now. Many teams were using wet-dry cycling, which was the technique we proposed. And so I came out of the closet right over here in the West Country at St. Giles House at Dennis McKenna's conference. Very impassioned, heartfelt talk. And it landed pretty well, and went on YouTube, and I just sort of waited for the other shoe to drop. But the other shoe was very, very nice, because 2 months later we met Ford and Sylvia, my co-founders, in Austin, Texas, at a party. They heard the story, and they said they had heard another story of a fellow who'd had a physics breakthrough smoking NN-DMT, and it just popped in their minds, and they decided to incubate the Center for Minds and to get a nonprofit going as something for social good and for the future of the field. And so we were established in the fall of 2023. Yeah. And to tell you, I know your original question was how is this accepted in our very conservative field. So our field of the origin of life has a long history of being inhabited by Nobel Prize laureates. Most of them pretty conservative people, and pretty focused people. And to the point where I was extremely nervous about one particular person critiquing what we were doing based upon, druggy use, as Kary Mullis had been criticized even after his Nobel Prize in 2003. And a phone call came to my colleague Dave Deamer from one of these very top-level respected scientists. The first thing he said on the call was, "I hear that Damer, we're Damer and Deamer on all our papers, Damer is using ayahuasca." Yeah. He is using ayahuasca, but no other further details. And I said to Dave, "Did he say anything else? Is there the other shoe drop?" "No, we just went on and talked about nucleic acid chemistry." Yeah. And I realized, okay, we've sort of crossed the Rubicon here. There wasn't sort of a disparaging comment or remark. And we're still doing everything we're doing. We're doing a major new initiative right now. So perhaps it was wise to wait those 8-10 years, but I felt that the benefit would be to create a new movement, in a sense, the fourth path of psychedelic practice and science. First being indigenous and spiritual, and the second being sort of personal growth, then therapeutics, and then this one as a creative catalyst. Yeah.
Amazing. To me, it's one of my fascinations is I'm now a decade into this field, and literally guided thousands with 5-MeO-DMT and psilocybin. Those are my compound teachers, the sacraments that have chosen me, I've chosen them. And what fascinates me is the amount of people that have received insight in problem solving that you wouldn't expect them to receive. But I'm a solopreneur, so there's only so much you can explore, and with the resources that you have. But they've literally now given an example of a case study of a lady that used to work as an HR manager in the US for a very famous Whole Foods company. And she had received in a psilocybin journey a very clear instruction how to clear the water in the community that she was from. She has nothing to do with environment, she has no idea. And it was a blueprint that she received. And I have multiple of these examples where I go, what makes it that what's the internal makeup, the psyche makeup, the conditions that someone in, and the fact that these intelligence know exactly who to give what to whom. So problems aren't always solved by the people you think they can be solved, but it's to me such an infant state of exploration. So I'm delighted that you're dedicating this time to go into, okay, what else can we access? And then there is another aspect that I'm curious about to hear from you, is the access to, I call it the realm beyond there's multiple layers in the expanded state with psychedelics, and I call it the layer of illusion and trinklets.
Tricklets.
The trinklets, you know, and that's not looking upon down it or any shape or form. And a lot of people have a lot of joy and a lot of beauty and healing from it and insight. But there's more layers into the metaphysical that one can literally download practices, martial art techniques, as knowledge about embodied techniques and techniques energetically to do surgery with people in a way, in healing work. So there's so much yet to explore. Are you also exploring those aspects? For example, what I just named with the research?
we're very open right now.
Yeah.
We funded our first study. It was announced in January, and you'll hear about it a little later this afternoon. And that's strictly clinical. The effects of psilocybin on memory, where memory gets stored. So 23 people will take psilocybin and go into an fMRI and do these complex memory tasks. And they'll see which brain region that is activated versus, say, the amygdala or the cortical area. And so that's long-term, multi-year kind of things of the mechanism. But then what Minds wants to do in its mission is to spread broadly and widely. So for instance, retreat centers, like some in the Netherlands, for example, where it's possible to it's almost like citizen science. There's so much rich qualitative and quantitative information about people's experiences and testimonials, and then their own developed architectures, their own practices, sort of introspective studies. There's so much richness, and it's actually less costly than the clinical work. So we have a whole initiative there to identify people who are doing these very high level work with people actively, you know, that's semi under the radar and maybe less so in places like Netherlands or Colorado or whatnot, but to engage what's already happening and just mine it as a rich vein of minerals about this practice. And we have a survey where people are filling out the last year or so. We're getting all these reports, some of them quite long. And this is what you do to start a platform in new science. Yeah, amazing.
We're almost coming to an end, and it's a full day. So I've got some random questions, but before I go that, what is the next thing you're going to see at a Breaking Convention?
The next thing we're going to see is...
Or meet.
Yeah. I think it's the last few talks. I'm really interested in Ali Biener's talk today.
Yes.
Or Bina, if you're German. Because he's got such an amazing overview of what's going on, especially socio-culturally. And then our friend Jamie Wheel, what he'll bring. And then the whole wrap up, I mean, how, you know, where we are now in 2025 in this field. And obviously, despite sort of the rejection of the FDA's, the new drug application for MDMA last summer, it's bigger than ever. There's more activity than ever. The upcoming conference in Denver for MAPS is even bigger than the one in 2023. So it doesn't show any signs of slowing down. And many countries are legalizing, Australia, you know, clinical use. And so the next thing for us that's very exciting is to pair with the therapeutic world. And I think you alluded to this earlier. If people undergo a healing, an unblocking, then there's a flow state where revealing happens, new capacities are opened in their bodies, in their visual capacity, in their ability to work with teams. Yeah. That's one of the interesting things about the executive, like connected leadership type studies. Yeah. That some of their results were the participants handle conflict in a different way after the psilocybin retreat. That really stuck. They just handle conflict with internals of the company or competition in the marketplace. Yeah, that's fascinating. You know, just in one experience to change the way you handle conflict. So to chronicle that, to work with filmmakers to get some of this into dedicated documentaries or short pieces, so the world knows that this is a thing that isn't just sort of being whispered about and under the table. That business leadership, science, tech, tech people and designers are just doing this all quite frequently, but there's no chronicling of that experience and the value to society. Yeah. And then in the end, organizations like the FDA, I mean, the FDA needs to be restructured to even evaluate these kind of complex modalities. They're not structured to do this. But say in the future, when governments look at the value to society, and I think in the 1970 Controlled Substances Act, there's a statement there where it talks about no measurable value to society. What we have to do is case building. So if we can validate through science and then valorize through practice that psychedelics and other mindfulness practices together can create enormous breakthroughs in innovation in the economy, in the heart of capitalism, it will change that valorization and people feeling they can do it in the light of day. Yeah. And with the support of their teams and have good protocols to use. It'll absolutely flip capitalism. It'll flip our ability to innovate in the time when we're going to need it even more and more. So it's strategic for human surviving and thriving on a planetary scale.
Yeah, absolutely. And indeed, with Alexander Beiner, been hosting retreats as well on leadership and seeing actual executives go and coming together. So partners from big organizations coming in together and doing their own, coming for their inner work, but then coming up with naturally solutions how to be together in that organization and change certain structures in that. And it wasn't because we probed it. It was just a natural occurrence because connection is the psilocybin is the connector. So it will work on where it is disconnection and reconnect naturally out of its natural state. So
and they ask questions like, why are we doing this?
Yes. Yes. Indeed. So I'm going to close with some random questions. And my favorite question to ask everybody, and I'm going to ask that to you as well, Bruce, is what is your favorite meal that reminds you of home?
Oh gosh, it's some kind of big warm casserole.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. On a winter's day, like in the UK here, that's what we need.
That's what you need for most of the year here, I think.
If you would be a psychedelic compound, which one would you be?
I would be the simplest tryptamine that can get through any membrane, can travel anywhere it wishes. Yeah. And it dances lightly on the receptors.
Yeah. What is your favorite kind of flora or fauna?
I think it's the Mariposa lily.
Okay, and why?
Because that was the original plant coming out of just near recently frozen ground in my hometown in Canada that led me to decide to work on the origin of life. Yeah. So it was a beautiful thing coming out of a simple bulb in the ground, and it caused this entire cascade of questions and direction. Yeah. Thank you so much, Bruce, for being here and taking the time, and excited to see your talk today. Thank you. Thank you, Natasja.